And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard R.J. Eskow. Joining us now to continue our conversations about the state of left media, such as it is Katrina Vanden Heuvel. You know Katrina's work, of course, from the Washington Post and The Nation, where she is, I believe, publisher. Is that right, Katrina?
Publisher, and I'll sweep the floors as I leave as well. So I do a mix of things at The Nation.
And I don't think you're still chief editor, but you
I'm
might.
editorial director, and in that context, think a lot about independent media, left media, and in fact, we just published a special issue this past week on consolidation, media squeeze, independent media, the future of left independent media, which I was
Well,
in.
it's a subject close to my heart. And my copy apparently hasn't arrived in the mail yet. So maybe you could just give us a couple minute overview of your findings. I gather it's not great uplifting news, but what do you find?
Richard, we talked before we started. In 1996, we started the National Entertainment State Series. It was our first centerfold. And you could see that it had different octopi. What it was designed to do in many ways was to show the impact of consolidation, conglomeratization, Murdochization on our media culture, and to show how publications, newspapers, magazines at that time, 96, were a small cog in a corporate structure. And what that meant was, you know, these corporations go to Washington for regulatory business. They have all kinds of contacts and interlocking networks. And it was not conspiratorial, it was vivid and it was factual. So we've been covering that issue. We did a story about a special issue on publishing consolidation on radio. And then we returned 10 years later to look at the consequences. But we've been active in the media democracy movement, which I know you've written about and thought about. John Nichols and Robert McChesney, in about 1996, founded Free Press out of the Nation article they wrote. And I think that's been an important group because it's the fate of the content of left media, which I care a lot about, that it get a hearing and not be blocked between the mainstream and the right. But it's also structural change that needs to happen, whether it's media ownership, broadband issues, net neutrality, which needs a new name. And I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was very interesting in that it lifted up the media issue, media democracy, because he had followed the trajectory of that movement over time and he spoke to it effectively. And I think more people in Congress, but especially movements around the country, understand the importance of coverage of what a right media can do, but also a liberal media. I'm thinking of the important strikes we've seen in the last months. Often mainstream media, as you know, parachutes in, finds the conflict and leaves.
Right.
But, you know, and so we've seen different coverage in that way, or different coverage of movements. There's a lot of hostility. We're looking at the streets filled with, you know, people who want justice in Palestine, those who feel oppressed or angered or victimized in different ways, generational issues. I think the media is having a very tough time. And I think we'll see how it evolves.
For sure. And one of the struggles I have, Katrina, with thinking about the issues around left media is that word left, because it means different things to different people, right? To some people, MSNBC is left media, and I'm not, you know, God bless them, I guess. But to me, left media means maybe you know, left is a little bit of a Rorschach test word, right? It means different things to different people. Might tell you more about the person than about any objective external reality. But to me, left includes economic equality, democratic equality, and an understanding that we need to dial down the war machine and military adventurism. And I find that a lot of what are described as left outlets might disagree on one or more of those issues. So at times I feel like a lonely person because although I know there are others and there are great people doing work out there, including you guys at the Nation and you yourself and others, but it seems at times as if there are, if you're going to go the route of, as if every left journalist has to be a brand now and it
I
has to
know.
be a kind of marketing.
Secular amen, because I too, when someone calls, I mean, you mentioned MSNBC, the left. I mean, it's part of a corporate structure, MSNBC,
Right.
NBC, and there's some good voices on it, but it's not the left. Noam Chomsky is the left, but what we know is there are many lefts, and they're different. They're different issues. What I find difficult is, I too believe you want to speak to where people are. I'm so bad about that I argued in a column about 6 months ago that every family should be given a hearing aid. I mean, just like something tangible that would open up communications, but drug prices, kitchen table issues, as they are called. But what strikes me, Richard, is the military issue, if you want to call it that. I won't call it Defense Department anymore. It's a War Department. And why is peace so subversive? I mean, there's almost a feeling that there's a danger if we don't remain the indispensable nation. And that afflicts a lot of liberal coverage. To name a name, George Packer, a liberal in the Atlantic, is arguing, that this is 1940 and Zelensky's Churchill, and we have to send more weapons. But I will say that depresses me because 10, 15 years ago, there was a path of a different kind, maybe 20 years ago. But there is such a commitment now to a kind of militarized security on the part of liberals, which is not new, Richard. You know this. I mean, we've seen the Cold War was run by both parties.
Right.
And, but I also think of independence, because if I value the nation, and I do, I think of how we take unconventional, unpopular, often minority, maybe it will become majority, alternative views. I think back to 67, if we're born in 1865, but when Martin Luther King Jr. spoke at Riverside Church against militarism, materialism, racism, the New York Times editorial criticized him for, consigning or degrading his civil rights politics and morality because of taking on anti-war politics. We called his a prophetic voice. And so I think there's an independence that is also, and I use this very humbly, there's a moral center sometimes. It's not about Babbitts or right wing, but about telling the truth as best one can.
Oh, I so agree. And I think that, one of the enemies of that moral force at times in the media, in the left media, is, I know to use the word tribalism is a disservice to indigenous cultures and so on, but I can't think of another word off the spur of the moment. The kind of political blue versus red, D versus R, that I won't name the MSNBC, as a matter of fact, personality who tweeted, for example, when Edward Snowden made his revelations, I just don't know what to think. This was under Obama, of course. I said, well, why don't you think what you would have thought if a Republican were president?
I know there is that, like Matt Gaetz, Republican, I don't know, I forget from where, he tweeted the other day something that I hate to say I kind of agreed with. I mean,
Right.
it was about bringing some funds home and not continuing with such a military weapons list. But people are skittish about, now we haven't talked about social media. In 1996, when we did the special issue, or when Alexander Coburn and Christopher Hitchens wrote for The Nation, there was no social media. And I do think the herd mentality, if I could put it that way, thrives on social media. I find it useful. I find Twitter useful. I found several things today I might not have found that were intelligent, but people go to war on Twitter or campaign, it seems to me, often do so to narrow what we're all talking about now, which is free speech. And how do you best nurture free speech without a tribalist campaign against it?
And the fact is that free speech, whatever political party you belong to, is going to inconvenience your political party at some
It's
point.
inconvenient truth. Now, we live in a country, Richard, where we're poor. We have two political parties. We don't, we have more. But I mean, within those parties, you
Right.
know, certainly the Democratic Party, there are different. If we were a parliamentary system, there'd be 3 or 4 parliamentary groups in the Democratic
Right.
Party. I can't speak right now for the Republicans. And I think the power to make coalitions is interesting. But, you know, most of the MSM, mainstream media, really echoes, it seems to me, the establishment wings of the Democratic Party. And when there was one, I mean, there is an establishment wing of the Republican Party. I'm not sure it's echoed. It's often demonized in ways that are cheap grace. You know,
Right. Well, it's often elevated in ways that are cheap grace too,
the way
right?
Trump was covered was, you know, elevating him as they thought they were taking him down. I mean,
I
I'm
mean,
thinking
Liz
2000.
Cheney, I'm sorry to interrupt, but please, this lionization of these wretched people, you know, that George W. Bush, war
Well, I
criminal.
think our politics and our media, you know this, Richard, better than I do, were so rocked by Trump because I think the media didn't understand that there were, if you were following Bernie, supporting Bernie, you understood that there was anger in this country. There was an anger that could be turned into a multiracial populist coalition, or there was one like Trump's. But people in this country, they're not all swinging around on the yacht or, you know, having lunch with Chuck or, you know, Nancy. And
Right.
they weren't being heard. And in that, there's, you know, there's racism, but there was a reason. And when you got 70% of Park Avenue folks supporting Trump as they did in 2016, maybe not, and you have people in Ohio, Wisconsin, working in the factories, which he promised he wouldn't close, but he did, you got a coalition. But people were shocked. I mean, Richard, at the Nation, it was still, we went to work the next day, but lots of groups needed to have therapy for the week because there was such trauma. And, you know, okay, but I think there's a hardcore politics. And our former intern, Edward Miliband, who had been in the Labor Party, had headed it for a brief time, came through in July 2016 on his way to a Brexit conference at NYU. And we're all saying she ran a lousy campaign, but she's going to win. And he said, you guys are real sanguine. Because he through Brexit, which has this.
Right. Well, I know I'm going to have to let you go, unfortunately, because there's so much more that we could talk about. But I will say that throughout that whole 2016 campaign, I kept saying, I don't know. I don't feel safe. And everybody finally, some Democratic consultant convinced me I was worrying about nothing. But I think that anger, you know, is a powerful force for good or evil, like they used to say about the atom when they first
It's so
discovered.
true. And I
So,
think we have a good friend who called me around 9 p.m. election night and said a curse word, you know, he did it because this person wise you know, said running a lousy campaign, she is, but she's going to win. She's going to win. Anyway, but I think what we know, I think you know better than I do because you were working different ways, but Trumpism is what really I think needs to, because that's part of the world fabric too. We see, you know, in Argentina, in
sure,
Hungary,
Germany,
the
Greece,
rise of the right.
right, right. So, yeah, it's a symptom. Trump is a symptom and not a disease. And I'll just close with this. I was traumatized by that election too, even though I wasn't surprised. And about 3 days later, I was in a meeting with one of the nuns who had risked a lifetime in prison with Father Dan Berrigan. And she just said,
Yes,
good Lord,
amazing.
man, pull yourself together. We've got a lot to do. You're too upset.
That's
Uh,
very good. I like that. Yeah, get
yeah,
yourself, that's, and she, they have the wisdom and the right.
Right.
just that.
Absolutely. So
No, and
Katrina,
I do think, you can quote from here to eternity, but there's darkness before the light there, but there's no alternative to continuing to work, in my view.
absolutely. Well, and I call it my Pascal's wager with the future. It might not work, but what
Right.
if it could work and we didn't do it, right? So let's do it. So
But
as
thank you
a,
for having me on.
and
And
thank you for all your
people should
great work.
support you. We should support voices of independence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katrina Vanden Heuvel. I will be right back. I'm Richard R.J. Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.